Thank you, Richard, for organizing a session on this topic. It's now close to my heart for some of the reasons that have been discussed here. Just one quick point that was prompted both by yesterday's conversation and the beginning of this morning is we should be very careful to distinguish complicated and complex. They are not the same thing. As you know, the most, let's say, sophisticated, the most complicated Swiss watches in France have a mechanism called la grande complication. But the Swiss watch is not complex. It is not going to keep changing shape. It is not going to keep reorganizing itself with different parts and components. It is not going to give you different times more or less accurately at different points of the day, and so on and so forth. So it's very complicated, but it's not complex. If you want, and I highly recommend it, it's a fun movie. There is a movie called Babel. I don't know if some of you have seen Babel. Anyone who has seen Babel in this room? And it's a movie about complexity, about a series of events that have no logical ex ante way to be related to each other, but just unfold over time in a highly complex way. So let's be sensitive here about the difference. That's all what I'm trying to say. Now, on to the topic. I could not resist going back to Peter Drucker, and obviously you can read. Peter Drucker was not a great fan of government, or he did not, let's say, appreciate the performance of government very highly. The last one here is, modern government has become ungovernable. That was back in 1969. Have things much improved? I'm not sure. I had the privilege a couple of days ago to be in a meeting in Copenhagen where Peter Ho, who is essentially the architect and the leader of the Singaporean government development, if you wish, public administration development over a long period. He retired in 2011, but he was basically at the helm of the Singapore build-up for a long time. He was saying, we haven't seen complexity yet. You can read the quotes, it's coming. We're on the cusp of it, and we are unprepared, and we'll have a lot of surprises. So I think it's very, very timely, actually, that we look at those issues. And I won't elaborate too much on the point that was made earlier, but just again, as a word of background, governments have multiple goals, face multiple demands from citizens, so their utility function is actually much more complex than that of companies. Even if you look at triple bottom lines or whatever it is, companies have a much easier time vis-a-vis multiple demands. Decision-making everywhere, but more so in governments perhaps than in companies, a highly political process. Not political in the macro-political sense necessarily, but political in the interplay between individuals. Governments cannot really choose their customers. Actually, a bit building on what Adrian was saying about the services of government to people who need it most, the customers who really want you as a government are the customers you do not want, because they will be the most difficult, the most demanding, the ones with the greatest social and personal problems, health difficulties, and so on and so forth. And government is the problem solver of last resort, not just when the complexity storm engulfs the financial system like a few years ago, but generally speaking, when we don't know what to do, we turn to government and say, okay, that's your problem now, sort it out. And what we see over time, and that's what we are researching, we see an increase in the so-called wicked problems, let's say complex problems which are very multifarious ways of manifesting themselves, an increase in the number and intensity of these wicked problems. And those result from complexity and interdependencies and so on and so forth. Now, what does that mean? It means that, and this is a very, given the very limited time, this is a very kind of a stylized little graph. It means that governments have been essentially dealing with the easy part. They have been dealing with relatively simple problems in the context of high-growth economies where resources were abundant, the lower left here. As countries developed, governments actually became sources of rigidity, because if you implement very well disciplined mechanisms, it has been generally known as new public management. And the idea has been to borrow the discipline of organization and management processes from divisionalized companies, including management by objective, KPI, rewards, and so on and so forth, and essentially apply diversified companies' management principles to governments. And that has worked for simple problems which could be decomposed, where there was very little system complexity. What we see over time now is, the issues are becoming more complex and the governments are becoming less resource-rich. Someone was making the point, if you remember, at the end of last afternoon's session about slack resources. There are no slack resources. Most governments are bankrupt or nearly bankrupt. So we are facing tremendous problems there. So that's a little bit what we try to look. Now, it's not all negative. I just borrowed one page from Finland's national strategy documents, where you can see the opportunity around aging and wellness and so on. It's both a problem with an aging population dispersed over a very large expanse of land once you move away from the Sassen coast, but it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity perhaps for Finland to mobilize its capabilities and competencies to become one of the key, not just lead markets, but lead providers of healthcare and well-being solutions for the elderly. But you can see the points: collaboration, culture, and all things have to come to play together. We went through a phase where we said, okay, and that was really the OECD, borrowing our ideas that we had first developed in the context of corporations and saying, we can take these so-called strategic agility principles and apply them to governments. And that's roughly the idea that, in simplified terms, there are a series of measures that can be taken to improve strategic sensitivity, to improve the level of awareness, understanding, real-time sense-making, and so on, some of the points that were raised yesterday. There are also a series of measures that need to be taken to foster resource fluidity, which is the ability to reallocate resources toward problems rather than just have legacy budgeting. And there are also a whole series of issues around leadership unity, the ability of the government to act as a true team with cabinet responsibility. And that's roughly where we have been. Now, that's not enough. I think what we find is, again, when one deals with simple problems and relatively slow change, then the focus has to be on efficiency and discipline, and that's where new public management actually works. Once we move up a little bit, both toward complexity and toward speed, then one needs to reinforce the strategic sensitivity, just be able to make better and faster sense about what's taking place outside. And then the key drivers, if you wish, become a mix of insight and vision. And vision is purposefully, in my mind, an ambiguous word because you can use it both as ambition, in a way. You can use it also as quality of eyesight, quality of perception. And what we find is that we move into trying to deal with really complex issues, then the question becomes, to what extent do we need resilience and values? It's impossible to make sense. We need to be more flexible. We need to be more adaptable. Actually, when we talk about requisite variety as a fundamental principle of system adaptation, again, variety is not a very good word. Variety gives the sense of there are plenty of different things. It's very varied. Actually, flexibility is what we need. There is no way an organization is going to be as varied as required by the nature of its environment. But an organization may become flexible enough to be able to actually adapt itself to the environment as it evolves, and to be guided more by principles and values and norms of social coherence in action, rather than by procedures or rather than by structures and formal processes. So that's what we saw a little bit. I'm going to go through very quickly through this because we are running a little bit out of time, but essentially you can look at it a little, and we'll circulate obviously these slides, but the idea there is, if you look at those three columns, they really represent three very different systems. There is a system, again, of rational strategic management, if you wish, applied to governments, which has a certain number of assumptions about people, about analysis, about predictability, and so on. You can read it. In the middle, you have essentially the strategic agility model, which relaxes a lot of the rigidities, or try to overcome rigidities, but still maintains the assumption of some form of central sense-making, or at least coordinated and integrated sense-making. And then when you move into really adaptive governance, You have to relax this assumption of integrated sense-making and just say, like we saw yesterday in the flock of birds, there are going to be a whole bunch of adjusting mechanisms between independent agents. So that's the governance challenge, if you wish. How do we move from incremental adjustment, at which governments have been good, to being both agile and adaptive? That raises a series of questions. I'm not going to frustrate you by raising those questions, but not being able to answer them very convincingly at all. One is, which I think is a huge issue. When we talk about complexity, we say, well, basically we need to have collective organizational learning, networked learning, whatever. We heard a lot of that yesterday, by the way. But if you're facing very rapid change, is your learning valid? If the system changes more rapidly than you can learn, then you are lost. And then that raises a question about is evidence, so-called evidence-based, which has become one of the buzzwords of public policy discipline. Is it applicable? Perhaps not. What is the evidence? If the evidence is misleading, if the evidence is going to show up in 20 years' time, well, it's not terribly useful in the context of short-term political decision-making. The stakeholders are unknown. Well, let's do stakeholder mapping, fine. But in complex situations, we don't even know who the stakeholders are. They will be revealed over time by the way the systemic interactions unfold. Flexibility versus variety, I spoke about. Oops, sorry. We also kind of tend to borrow the idea of clear goals, national visions, and so on and so forth. Well, I'm not so sure. There is a need, perhaps, I think John Kay was making that point when he was writing this book about, I can't remember, oblicity, I think he called it, or obliquity. But it's essentially saying if you want to achieve results, perhaps you should not reveal the point you really want to get to, and you should be happy, a bit like in sailing, to kind of, tag and turn as you get there. And I think actually, if I may quote John had this wonderful phrase in one of our discussions. He said, the best reforms are silent reforms. And then lastly, are the people up to it? Again, I had a very good discussion a couple of days ago with a bunch of people building CR, Peter Ho and his lieutenants, if you wish, and they were saying most of the people, most of the government officials don't have the courage to act under uncertainty and ambiguity. Most of them are not very comfortable with so-called adaptive decision-making processes, where it's not an act of leadership by the leader, but it's essentially tossing the problem back to even the population, to much wider groups, and just saying, let's kind of create some kind of collective process for trying to address the problem. And then there are issues about values, skills, capabilities, and collaborative, integrative comfort, if you wish. The ability to work in truly complex organizations is perhaps not one of the main characteristics of most civil servants. So I think there's a huge challenge here, but it's a very important one. And if we can make a little difference to improve things, that can have a huge payback. Thank you.